Well, Jillana, it's so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just discovered that you woke up super early to have this conversation with us because you're in a completely different time zone. And I am so grateful that you woke up and that you are, I mean, I would have never guessed it. I would have thought you were way ahead of us time-wise because you're fresh and you're vibrant and you're excited and full of life this morning.
Oh, man. You know when you like set your alarm early for like a flight or something and you wake up multiple times in the middle of the night because you're like, I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss it. So that was me last night.
I do that all the time. And then you get done with whatever thing that you had to wake up for and you are just gassed. You're like, oh, I'm exhausted. I need
It's going to be worth it. So worth it to have a conversation.
This is going to be worth it. I'm so excited to have this conversation. I would love for our listeners, one, to just get to know you a little bit. So why don't you tell us right now what life is like? Where are you located? What do you guys do? And then we'll dive back into your story because your journey has been quite a unique one.
So I've been married to my best friend, Luke, for 22 years. There are 5 children who call me mom, 3 of whom have come into my life via the foster care system. All 3 of my boys actually have entered my life via foster care, 2 of whom are officially adopted. One of whom, interestingly, we had the privilege of fostering when he was a little boy. We were 25, Davey, ripe old age of 25 with like zero parenting experience. So like what could ever go wrong, you know?
Oh yeah. Fostering's an easy way to ease into parenting, isn't it?
Exactly. I tease that it's like the helicopter drop in the middle of the ocean. You know, there's no easing into the shallow end here. But anyway, he is now 25. His name is Royal. We connected when he was 19. So I still include him as one of mine, even though we have no legal connection. It is not lost on me that when he was placed with Luke and I at 6 years old, he did not have a choice. But as a 19-year-old young man, he absolutely has a choice. And so it has been a wild and whirly journey of reconnecting with him over the last 5 years. So we live in Portland, Oregon. We have 2 biological daughters who are 18 and 15, and then 2 boys who are not related to one another, who are 14 and 11. We have lived in Oregon for 15 years, and I made what I thought was going to be a purely introductory call to the Oregon Department of Human Services Child Welfare to say, hey, we just moved from Buffalo, New York, where we're still certified. I'm just gathering information. You know those phone calls you make where you're I'm just going to like jot down a few notes and like file it away somewhere. And maybe in a year or so, I'll come back and I'll be ready to engage. And, a week later, they were bringing in this 6-month-old baby boy to us. And so he is now my 14-year-old son. A lot of my book, The Love Stretch Life, is really about engaging in a 13 and a half year relationship with Micah's beautiful first mom, Jennifer. That has been an absolute transformational relationship in my life, that God has invited me to really experience kinship with someone that I never thought that I would have the privilege of engaging with. And really, through foster care, through adoption, through proximity to people whose stories are so different from my own, I have seen God in fresh ways. And I've recognized that from a distance, things can look pretty neat and tidy, pretty black and white. And it's humbled me because there have been many times over the last, decade and a half where I really believe that I know clearly like what I'm seeing. And then I get up close and personal and I have to realize, I had no idea. Like there's so much nuance here. There's so much heartache here. There's so many things that I have never experienced. So I say that foster care has kind of been my personal invitation to like heartbreak and suffering in a lot of ways, because I think whenever you raise your hand to say, I would like to welcome in a child whose life has gone so terribly awry that the state would have to come in and function, as their guardian. I think I oversimplified it, Davey, like 20 years ago. I'm 45 now. Like we started a long time ago. The fact that we started foster care before we had biological children really has been super super informative. Something I don't often share, but I want to share with you. I talk about it a little bit in my book, is just, how our own early experiences shape us. Like we know that in relation to trauma. And I think sometimes for those of us that are walking into foster care and adoption, we have trauma from like an other lens, like your trauma. And I think it really invites us to engage our own trauma. And for me, part of my story is that, the goal of foster care is to reunite kids safely when possible with their biological family. And I really underestimated the toll that would take on me, seeing my biological daughters say, "Hey, where are you going with my brother?" Which we had never even used that term. They just bestowed that family term on this baby that had been placed with us. And it just brought back so many memories of when I was 6 years old saying, "Hey, where are you going with my brother?" And it was that my parents engaged after they had me. They just engaged a long battle with infertility, which of course, when I was a little girl, I could not understand or appreciate. I just was like, why isn't your tummy like round like my friends' moms, And my mom has now told me she's just cried a lot of, quiet, salty tears on her pillowcase over that season. But we eventually, with all the adoption books, we were eventually chosen. And I just remember just the elation of like being chosen and having this baby boy placed with us. And I remember like sleeping in his room and having my, crayon taped up drawings, like professing my love for him on all over the wall. And then I distinctly remember the phone call that my mom got at the 11th hour saying that the mom had changed her mind and she wanted him back. And remember, the lawyer showing up at her house with her and then it was gone and then it was over with. Wow. And, it's interesting because my parents said, we thought that experience would ruin you. Like this was the thing that you wanted more than anything. And it was given to you and then it was taken from you as a child. Wow. But I really do believe somewhere deep in there that experience did help shape my journey of going into foster care and adoption. Yeah. And what's really, really wild, Davey, is that, we were told, that this baby and his mom were going to go, someplace far, far away. And it turns out that he lived in the community that was just 20 minutes from me my whole life, which makes me think, was I ever standing next to him in the grocery store? All those things. And so when he was 18. And again, there was just a break. Like he came, they picked him up. There was no contact, but we did still remember his name. And, around 22 years ago, there was a late breaking news story of two teens that had broken into a home in search of, presumably in search of, drugs, and things went awry. And one of the teens, shot himself, and it was the name of this baby that was placed with us. And so it really, so we had the privilege of attending the funeral and seeing that so many of the photos that his biological mom, had of him were photos that my family had taken of him and given to him, of his beginning start. And so, wow. I want to be very clear. I recognize this is complicated. I'm not ever once blaming, that mom for changing her mind. That was well within her right to do. But I'm just speaking from a child that experienced that side of it. And then being left with kind of these questions that almost feel like they're kites in the sky, right? Of okay, God, if that child had been raised in our family, would he still have been in that house that day with that gun, searching for those things? And these are just, I think, ways that we have to just hold the tension and embrace or battle the mystery, right? Right. Because those are unanswerable questions. Absolutely. Man, I mean, Jillana, you've already said so many things that I'm over here writing some notes because I want to unpack these things. I mean, You just kind of stated it again right there, that there's so much nuance that often we enter into life if we haven't experienced a whole lot of trauma or pain and suffering. There's so many people who are listening to this, you have experienced a lot of pain and suffering. And so you probably have this lens almost from the outset, as long as you can remember,
you have a lens of nuance where things aren't as black and white or binary or as neatly packaged as what, some of us, I didn't have really hardly any childhood trauma, and it wasn't until the tragedy happened in my life in 2015 of losing my wife that I started seeing a lot more nuance and gray, and at the same time seeing Jesus in those spaces, right? Yeah. Things that used to seem very binary to me, very black and white, very either or, no longer seemed either or. It seemed very messy and beautiful and all of those things combined, and it's very hard to reconcile those things. And I know, as you're describing your experience right there with fostering, and then these questions that are arising of, what if he had stayed placed in our home? What if this hadn't, could this have changed the chain of events that ensued in his life? And answers that you'll never know, questions you'll never have the answer to. That's a very difficult thing to wrestle with. Yeah.
And I want to be clear, this was, for me, this was kind of the one mar on like a really pretty delightful childhood. And so, I think for me, I still had some of what you have experienced, with kind of the messiness. I still had a little bit of a messiness shock because still, in my childhood, 7 to 8 year old brain, this is very different than beginning to hear my daughter point her pudgy little toddler finger and be like, where are you taking my brother? I had no idea that would bring back that flood of memories. Wow. I thought that was just in the past. That's in the past, Yep. And so I think, I think one of the things that's been really interesting to me is just, I think for a long time, Davey, really underestimated like how God has created our bodies to actually store things.
Yeah.
I think I kind of was like, well, not that I would ever say we're like a bobblehead and a brain and this is, honestly, but like, I think that has been one of the main things that I've been invited to, just realize I've been late to the game with that, reconsider that. And I think, parenting my precious Charlie, who I know we'll talk about in a second, that has fetal alcohol syndrome, it has certainly invited me to try to integrate things that I thought before were a little bit more separated. Yeah. Just in terms of like the daily fight or flight or the anxiety or the depression or whatever it is that we're feeling. Sometimes all of those at once, sometimes all of those in an hour, right? That our body does, like the way God created us is not as, we have finite capacity, right? We don't have infinite capacity to just absorb all of it, even with the Lord's help. We
can't even, we can't hold all of those things in our conscious mind. There's so much that gets stored in our subconscious, and that's the way God created our bodies to work. One, for survival, and then two, for us to be able to, for things to be brought to the forefront when they need to be brought to the forefront. And that's what I love about what you said right there. When your toddler was like, "Hey, what are you doing with my brother? Where are you going with my brother?" Right there, this is probably something that I've seen as more a universal principle than what many would think. And that is that God will take us into these experiential situations that cause the old memories or latent trauma that we haven't really dealt with, cause those things to arise. And so sometimes we think even dealing with trauma it should be so neat and tidy, especially in Christian circles. Well, I had this experience, and so I go to see a counselor. And that's not often how God invites us into healing. A lot of times God invites us into healing by causing other things to arise, like difficult, painful, almost negative situations, tense situations that draw back to those early childhood traumas. And then he kind of rewrites those as we're experiencing them. Yeah. And I think it sounds to me that's a little bit of what God was doing right there in your experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you mentioned in Christian circles, I think so oftentimes, and that's what I love about the Nothing is Wasted podcast, is that so oftentimes in Christian circles, we wait to talk about what is messy until it's a little tidier, maybe more palatable for others. And we can like wrap this like beautiful bow called God's faithfulness around it, because we want to share about the hard stuff. And then in the next breath, talk about the blue, sunny skies, because that's what other people are wanting. That's as believers. That's like what, and I think we have to pitch that formulaic piece out the window to just say, there may never be a bow to tie around this. What does it look like to be walking on a long, gravelly, windy road? What does it look what does it look like to pick up, a pebble that says hope, and to just hold that in my hand, and to know that this might be as close as I get to a bow. It's just holding this, just trying to see it,
That's so good. That's so good, Jillana. Okay, why don't you give us a little bit of context? So we can wrap our heads around a little bit of your journey. How did you get into fostering? When did you get in? I know you said 25 years old. So kind of give us a little bit of the timeline, and maybe tell us how many kids you have fostered. Just let's walk down the journey a little bit, because I know we definitely want to talk a little bit about your son that you just mentioned that you guys have raised for quite some time. Yeah.
Yeah. So at 25, we welcomed Royal. We had him for a year. We had accepted multiple kids on a short-term basis. We moved to Oregon 15 years ago. That's where I was invited to start this 13-and-a-half-year relationship and counting with our now adopted 14-year-old's first mom, who's been super influential in my life. And we've had the messy privilege of adopting one of her children and then actually fostering and court-ordered returning her next child to them. So we had two brothers. Wow. So we are two moms in the same city that are raising two full biological brothers about 2 miles apart. So, I mean, there's a whole lot to unpack right there.
That's unheard of. That's crazy.
It's crazy.
I know I haven't lived very long, but I've never heard anything like that before. That's amazing.
It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. And we've gone through a ton of ups and downs and have kind of experienced, honestly, every emotion under the sun with and toward one another. But it has been such an invitation for me to experience more of God and to just experience his closeness and his presence, and the fact that he's like with me no matter what, even in the midst of the unexpected. Really, the unexpected was when we thought we were good, honestly, with 3 children. We had our 2 biological daughters. We had just adopted our 14-year-old, and then we got a call, Davey, and we weren't even on the list to get a call, but there's just a crisis shortage of foster homes in so many communities, including ours. And they just said, hey, we know you're not on the list to receive foster placements, but there's a little baby born at the hospital right down the road from you. And we are wondering if you can pick him up and care for him, quote, for the weekend. Unquote. And so, the conversations one has with their spouse about like making a lifelong commitment versus can you do something for 48 hours are two totally different conversations. In fact, my husband, who's not like a big video game player at all, but he happened to be next door at our neighbors playing NBA Jam. And I literally had the gal on the phone and I was like, hey, babe, can we take a baby just for the weekend? And he was like, sure. I mean, the amount of thought that we put into
the background here, he's on fire.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, you're getting the picture here. This isn't like a thoughtful, prayerful, like this is, but, we went to the hospital and we were handed this just adorable little boy. And we were privileged to take him home just for the weekend. And when that weekend was up, the agency said, gosh, we are really trying to locate some relatives. Can you hold on for just a little bit longer? Because that is usually the goal, is that they're, searching for biological family members. And we were like, yeah, we didn't need a ton of convincing to just, have our arms twisted to keep on caring for him ourselves. And that happened repeatedly for several months. And then it just kind of felt like, okay, well, we're a family of 6 now. And so we adopted Charlie at 2. And, looking back, Davey, there are signs, you can, looking back, I think it was a very much an invitation for me to go with my with my parental gut. Having parented kids that had come from a background of abuse and trauma, I still felt like there was something a little off. He never, ever slept. He was late to crawl and walk and talk and get his teeth and all of those things. But, there is a very big continuum of what kind of falls into like global developmental delays. And most professionals have a very cautious, like, let's wait and see approach. So I kind of hung with that, like, let's wait and see. But approaching 4 years old, it was like, I know we don't, I want to hold a lot of space that we didn't know the conditions of his biological mother's like pregnancy experience. With not a whole lot was known about her, and yet there is more going on than met the eye. And so it wasn't until I did a deep dive myself, I felt like I was this detective with this magnifying glass, like searching for clues. And I read a specific book about fetal alcohol, the bullet points, and man, Davey, he just like hit every single one.
Wow.
And initially there was almost some relief, almost some of like, hey, I've solved the mystery.
We have some answers.
Yeah, we have some answers. We have a thing. We have a name. And the prognosis is, better for kids that, where there's that, where we can name it earlier.
Right.
But it wasn't long after that when I'm starting to read about lifelong, irreversible brain damage. It is one of the most preventable causes of intellectual disability in the world. And I think what's so challenging is that people look typical. And so we're going on their behaviors. And it's really, really hard when we don't know the conditions that kids have experienced to think, well, this is just trauma. And that could be part of it. But we need to have a clear interpretation of what we're seeing to guide our intervention. And the reality is fetal alcohol syndrome is brain damage. And as much as we can accommodate, and as much as individuals with fetal alcohol can be smart and creative and funny and loving, there's also a whole lot of other things that often have them presenting as a very prickly porcupine. That can be really, really tough. And that's a huge underestimation.
Yeah. Now, how's that been for you guys? I mean, try to paint a picture for me, because there's, from what I understand, and I know I talked to you a little bit, we have some friends who have a son with fetal alcohol syndrome as well. And there's like the internal battle and within your home, right? And then there's also the external battle. So like, struggles with, all the external decisions, education, when you're trying to, whether it's, trying to travel or you're with other people, or, there's a lot of complications. And I know I'm sure it's a continuum, right? Like fetal alcohol syndrome will present itself differently in different cases. There's not like a, one track type description for it. Right. But for you guys, can you talk to me a little bit about the struggle internally within your home as you guys have been raising him and you've been experiencing this? And then what's it like? And I guess I asked this question because I was uneducated about it until our friends, really have informed us. And it's like, oh my gosh, wow, man. And so you have a lot more empathy than, for both the child that's suffering with that and the families surrounding him. And so it kind of paint a picture for us so that our listeners can clue in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you mentioned that it is a spectrum disorder. It's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And actual fetal alcohol syndrome is at the more severe impacted, part of the continuum. It looks different for every individual. It's, it really depends on kind of how long the baby was exposed to alcohol in utero and the frequency of drinking. But I mean, this much remains, like, we know that there's no amount of alcohol that's safe to drink at all. It depends on, the mother's prenatal nutrition. I mean, it just depends on all of these factors. But, in our particular case, and in a lot of cases with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, individuals function developmentally much less than their chronological age. So for example, my son is 11, and take what you would, think of most 6-year-olds kind of operating at. And that is the level at which he needs support. Right. There's a kind of a mishmash of different skills, which makes life really confusing, I think, for him and for the rest of us, because it would almost be easier, Davey, if everything was chronically low developmentally or medium or high, but it's this weird spike of like, wow, he can put together amazing Lego creations, so creative, but he is completely taxed by writing his name because he doesn't have the rote memorization of how to form letters. You know, you wouldn't think that those things would go together. He can read, but he cannot spell more than the first consonant of the letter. And so there's just this kind of cruel combination. And one of the specialists that I saw shared with me that oftentimes individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder process everyday conversations the way you and I would when there's a crackly phone connection and we can kind of like hang with what the person's saying, but we're not getting every single word. It's not crystal clear, but we're kind of getting the gist, but we can miss things. And that is often how my son experiences everyday conversations, which means he can seemingly hang and we're like, we're good, right? We're on the same page until there's something that's missed. And then there's a volcano of, of explosion, of exasperation, which I would be exasperated too. Like I said before, I think what's hard is that except in a rare amount of very small cases, are there facial indications of in utero alcohol exposure. And so we're really looking at an invisible brain-based disability. And because we can't, open up somebody's head and peer into their brain to say, is it looking typical in here or not? We are just going with how people present on the outside. And so it's a pretty cruel combination to have somebody that struggles with brain differences and can be, like I said before, I really want to be sure that I'm not painting this all as doom and gloom. Individuals with fetal alcohol can be loving and creative and funny and have a lot to offer. And also that usually comes with, anger, explosion, aggression, perseveration, which is like hyper-focused thinking where like a thought is on a train track and you just can't get off that train track until you're kind of all at the mercy of buckling up on the train until that individual loses steam with like what that thought was. But that is a very hard way to live because it feels like you don't have control.
The Nothing is Wasted content library of resources and podcast episodes are made possible by our growing community of members. If you would like to be a part of having a global impact and help people partner with God to take back their stories, consider joining Community Plus for just $20 a month. Your membership comes with access to a course called Position for Redemption, master classes taught by our certified coaches, bonus podcast episodes, and Q&As with myself and some of our other special guests. You can get more information and sign up at nothingiswasted.com/community. I look forward to connecting with you further within our Community Plus platform. Yeah, for sure. Well, talk to, and maybe we can talk about this particular like fetal alcohol syndrome myopically, but maybe we can also zoom out and talk about fostering in general. Where does grief play into all of this? For you guys, does it feel like you even have time and space to be able to kind of process through or is it like you're feeling like it's survival all the time? What have you learned about grief in the hardship of fostering, particularly in this kind of a situation?
Well, I'll zoom out and kind of talk about fostering and then I'll like zoom back into our specific conversation. I think what I have personally learned is that grief and loss is what lands kids in the foster care situation to begin with. No child ends up in foster care for no reason. So there's already been so much grief and so much loss interwoven into their story. So I should not be surprised when grief and loss continues to be part of the narrative. And I think so often, Davey, we as Christians believe that if we have the perfect concoction, like there's some secret formula, if we can believe that there's the right amount of like love, structure, nurture, discipline, sprinkle in some Jesus, this equals clean slate.
Wow.
And that's what we want to believe. We want to
Yeah.
believe, that, and the reality is, to be clear, that does happen. And I celebrate every single time that I see a family that's just really thriving. And what is also true, what we also have to hold the tension with, is that oftentimes that is not the story. And so where is God? How do we receive this when we are living a narrative where grief and loss continues to be interwoven into the story, which has been there since the start of whatever led them to be in foster care. So that's kind of the larger piece that I've taken away.
Jillana, before you zoom in, I just want to note this, because I think this is really, there's a very profound concept that you just unpacked right there, that so often we kind of come into situations as believers with this like savior complex, right? That says like, well, we have the answer, right? The gospel is going to be the answer to remedy this child's situation and their entire story. And so we begin to think that those are mutually exclusive concepts, that, where Jesus exists, there can't be this like hardship and grief and trauma that's continuing to reside. Like, it's going to fix it all. Right. Yeah. And that can easily, I don't even know why, but I'm just having this like realization, but that tends to be our mindset as we approach things. And that's not necessarily true, is what you're saying, right? There is so much mess where Jesus also exists. In fact, that's kind of where he ends up showing himself even more. We see the mysteries of who he is even more in the middle of the mess, and it doesn't resolve itself typically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, so often I think we can see parenthood as reflecting on us, right? Like, we want to believe that like input equals output. But really stepping into foster care and adoption, it is really an invitation to say, my input may be this. And if the output's this, I rejoice, praise God. But my input may be this, and my output may look like this. And there will be others that will look at me, honestly, the way that I think I had an internal monologue going in my brain, Davey, before the privilege of parenting, to say, wow, look at how that kid's behaving. I would never have said that out loud ever in a million years. But internally, you look at the kids that's struggling, that's like maybe flailing, that's cursing, that's trying to, hit their parents or whatever. And you go, I wonder what is or is not happening in that household to have a child that is behaving like that.
Always, right. Yeah.
And so I think that that's such an invitation for the rest of the community, but the church in particular, to wrap support around parents, to say, I see you, and I recognize that you are dealing with probably more than you thought that you would be engaging. And I think there's a protective grace sometimes with that we don't know, that we can't look down the road, right? Because for so many of us that are where we are right now, we would say, well, I would never want to go down that road.
I wouldn't choose that.
Because who would sign up for this, right? Exactly.
Right.
I think in my own story with our sweet son, I think I have just come to grips with, the stages of grief are different because no death has occurred in our family, but we are on a life altering path, a life altering path that's going to require a heavy dose of interdependence. And it has invited me to think about the beauty of interdependence. I think we just value self-sufficiency. We prize that so much in the community and in the church too, can you do it on your own? And the reality is we have a child that is always going to need some pretty heavy interdependence. And so the stages of grief, the swirl, it's not really been stages for me, but it's looked like bargaining. It's looked like seeking control, seeking solutions, feeling depression, feeling isolation, and then kind of coming to an active acceptance and integration. And then, doing that again.
And then all of that all over
again.
And
then all of that over again. Right. All of that over again. Right. Yeah.
Wow. So, it sounds like you guys, when you stepped into this, obviously you didn't know about his condition. And so would you say that would it be fair to say that you went into this fostering journey, particularly with him, thinking, okay, we're going to do this for a season, and at some point just like what I would deem as a normal parenting experience. At some point, we're going to be empty nesters, and we will have done a valiant thing to raise these kids and foster these kids. Was that somewhat the mindset going into all of this?
I think that we had been in foster care enough time to kind of lose a little bit of the rescue lens, which is a gift to us, to recognize like really it is about the witness. It is about the relationship. It is about, where there is love, God breaks in, so I feel, but even with all of that said, I didn't know about fetal alcohol. I really didn't. I didn't go in as we, cradled that baby at the hospital who looks so typical. I didn't go in thinking, wow, this is a lifelong commitment here for a child that is going to, turn our lives upside down.
Wow.
And so there's just been a lot that's come with that. But also, I have to say, there is a bit of an inverted gift with Charlie, because Davey, it's invited me to experience, it's invited me to see things that before with my other 3 children, I would have mistaken for a low level behavioral expectation. So now we're celebrating, like, you didn't swear on the bus. That's amazing. You stayed buckled in your ride to Target. That's amazing. Like all these things that before would have been like, I'm not even going to say anything because that is like that's just what we do, So now we're at the point where like all of the kind of that's what we do is taken off the table where we are able to see. But it's a profoundly different lens to be celebrating, things that I just never thought would be a celebration. And there is an invitation in that, but a lot of it is an invitation to slow down, which I'm not naturally good at, to just be able to like catch it and see it and celebrate it. Because the reality is we do not have good days and bad days. Our days are a constant intermingling of both. Right. And there's so much, I just feel like I'm surfing this wave of unpredictability every moment of the day. And that can cause me to walk on eggshells. Right. And so it's this weird kind of balance where I don't want to ever say that I've hitched the wagon of my well-being to a child who struggles with mental wellness, who struggles greatly. And yet it's undeniable that how he's doing affects me and the rest of our family. Yeah.
Right. Wow, man. So I'm curious what your conversations with the Lord have been over this journey. Have there been some particular, notable, really dark, deep conversations, and maybe some notable like revelations that God has brought you to that's like paradigm shifting for you? I mean, I feel like that's, especially in something like what you guys are experiencing, there's got to be some major wrestling that you've done with the Lord on this. I know you said bargaining earlier, but take me into that a little bit, and help us understand kind of where the Lord has met you in all of this.
I remember attending a parenting conference not too long ago. I think I just, I'm a learner. So I'm like sitting there front row with my journal open, like, what are drop it on me? Like, what are the gems here that I need to know to like figure out my life, to make it go a little smoother. And this particular speaker it was at a Christian conference, she was very well-meaning, of course, but she was having people repeat, like, you are enough, turn to the person next to you, remind them like you are enough. And really what I imagined her intent to be was basically like, we are not enough, but God is with us. And that was honestly kind of lost in the hollow hype because I just felt so lonely. I was like, I am not enough, And I think what's so interesting too, Davey, is that in the foster care and adoption world, you have people, well-meaning people that say things all the time like, God gives special kids to special people, or God will never give you more than you can handle. I'm sure and it's like, it feels so insulting because it's like, no, I have been given so much more than I can handle. And also God is with me And honestly, the biggest way that I have experienced that, besides, enrolling myself in steady counseling and trying to have, steady walks with a friend and journaling and all of those things, is through others that have the I get it factor, through others whose life has gone awry and kind of has the same common denominator of like, this isn't anything I would have ever chosen. It has indelibly left a print on my life that will be there forever. Yeah. And here we are, searching for God together. And so I really do have seen, through the body of Christ, like those that have lived this as well, kind of have become like our people. And we're not wanting to close ourselves off. Like we have a lot of friends that where foster care and adoption is not any part of their story. And I think we need everyone, but certainly the I get it factor of those that are also walking this road has been huge for us to just continue to feel like we can keep on going. I never noticed the verse, despite growing up in church most of my life, of Psalm 56:8, which says, "You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." And I'm like, that verse, like, where was that verse? I'm sure I read it, but I'm sure I read it, but it just didn't stand out to me in Technicolor like it does now. And I take comfort in the image of God collecting my tears in a bottle and recording these sorrows in his book. And to be clear, it's not all like doom and gloom and sorrowful. But joy does not come easy. We have to search for it.
Wow. That's a really good statement right there, Jillana, that joy does not come easy. We have to search for it. I think a lot of times people throw up their hands and give up when joy isn't coming easy. And then I also think that that's probably the very nature of joy, isn't it? Right? That joy is not something that's just going to come easy. Yet we want it to. We want it to so badly. Yeah.
And I think we want, there's just such an immediacy to everything. And I think there's also an allure of wanting to have it together, right? Like we're in an Instagrammable world where, people can kind of compare the squares of how their family looks to like, their other people's highlight reels compared to your like reality that looks a lot less glamorous. And I just think for those of us where grief is a part of our story, we need to be really mindful of like what we're taking in, because for me personally, that has been a recipe to just feel a little down, and I don't need any more of that. So I try to be really, really mindful. I actually have a 10-minute timer on Instagram and Facebook, and then it's just like, boop, you're done. Because I know that I need that, And so I think there are just some things that I've learned the hard way, just like small practical things where I'm like, this is not life-giving to me. It's making me feel, it's just making me feel really different. And I know that there are other families like ours where, there have been some major detours. And so, but it's hard to put a detour on an Instagram square, right? Like, how do you do that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Speaking of that, I'm always curious to talk to folks who have fostered, adopted, blended. We're a blended family. And so we see it, probably to a small degree of smaller than I feel like than what you guys are seeing it. But my perspective on what family looks like has certainly shifted since we've blended our family and we've experienced loss and grief. And I'm curious as to how your perspective on family has changed, given the journey that you guys have been on.
I would definitely say that my definition of family has widened, including our oldest Royal in our last 6 years of reconnection. That has been a widening of family, including our 14-year-old's first mom and her other children around our, table on a weekly basis. That has widened our family. Certainly the fact that what you see is not what you get, which we all know at some level. That's not like a rocket scientist statement right there. Right. But I think when you're parenting a child who looks typical, but has an invisible brain-based disability, that just invites you to see things differently. And so those are some of the ways that it's affected our family. I would tell you that, my older 3 teens, even my, teen that comes from a background of trauma, but is still neurotypical, they have an awareness that I never had at their age. They really do that like what you're seeing on the surface, like that internal monologue that I told you I kind of struggled with before living it and saying, oh my gosh, that child is now my child. And I know what's been poured into him. They've kind of dropped that from the beginning. And I think there's a real beauty there, but I also don't want to like rosy this up. It's really hard. I don't want to sugarcoat, like there's a toll on the whole family. And so, we raised our hands and we said yes to this precious little guy for the weekend. And that is now a lifelong commitment. And I think there are days where I just almost feel like, there are days when that just feels so heavy. And I just feel like, oh my gosh, I feel like I know we're promised like new mercies every morning, but I'm still not over the like lingering dark cloud of what happened last night to like wake up and be like, I'm here. I'm ready to embrace the new mercies. It's just, it's challenging.
Yeah.
And yet, I think it has invited us on a path that we would have never raised our hands to go down. And yet now we're here. We can't really envision not knowing what we know and not loving our son. We fiercely love our son, but we will always be liaisons for him in a world that's a not kind and hospitable place when what you see on the surface is different than like what somebody's capability is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I was just thinking about this as you were talking that, I grew up in a Christian home and all the Christian things and
Me too.
Youth camp growing up and went to a Christian college. And, I wasn't in a bubble by any stretch of the imagination because I was, an athlete. So I'm interacting with non-Christians all the time and stuff. However, the path was set in my mind of I'm going to marry a Christian girl. We're going to have 2.4 kids and a dog and a white picket fence. Like that seemed to be the Western Christian right thing to do in your life. If your life speaks of that, then you're in right graces with God.
Yeah.
And then, tragedy strikes and it fractures our family. And what I'm seeing in God's redemption and restoration is that there's that fracturing that nobody would really, it's not like they're going, I want that.
Yeah.
I want a fractured, broken, grief-stricken family. Nobody would say that.
Never.
However, I love what you described right there, that your view of family has widened, has broadened because of the redemptive things that you guys are stepping into. And I would say that's very consistent with what I'm seeing and experiencing now too. I look at our kitchen table and I look at all the weird, different, like incongruent pieces of our family, even extended family. And it's like, this is a really beautiful thing. And we would have never wished for or asked for the route or the journey that led us here. Yeah. But I can't imagine not having this as well at the same time.
Exactly.
And that's what's so wild about God's plan in our life. And it's so messy and beautiful and colorful and
exhausting.
Yeah. You're just like, what?
Yeah.
What is going on here?
Yeah. No, it feels like it's this like kaleidoscope swirl. Yeah. And so I think kind of gone are the days of like a little bit more, this is kind of like you were talking about, like, this is the path that is laid out before me. And this is what a good Christian life looks like. And this is what it looks like to be faithful and to have these things. And now we're just kind of in this, kaleidoscope swirl, and there's still goodness. It looks so different than anything we could have ever envisioned. And yet there still is goodness, but we have to sometimes squint, I think, to search for it. Right. It's not just like plopped up before us, like, oh, isn't that beautiful? Like sometimes I think that's the work that we're called to, is how do we squint and see the hope? How do we squint and see the joy? Sometimes it's obvious, but a lot of times it's not. And so how can we be honest about our journey, even with God, in the times where it's not obvious?
I want to talk a little bit about this new book, but before we dive into that, I'd love to hear, if there's someone who's listening to this and they have wrestled with a calling to fostering or adoption, They feel it, they sense it. They're like, man, I feel like this is something that God wants for us, but they're afraid. Mm-hmm. What would you say to them?
I would say, do your homework on trauma and secondary trauma. And it's not a matter of if the going gets hard, it's a matter of when the going gets hard. I know I might sound like I'm a loving bubble burster right now, but I want people to go in because I feel like the best thing, the most loving thing I can do is to say it's hard. And so, and have community around you, be surrounded with people that can uplift you in the journey, those that have walked the road before you of foster care and adoption and those that have not. And so, be prepared. Like there's a need, there's always a need. But in order to not sink yourself and your own family entering into this road, you really need to do your homework. And we can't ever anticipate, like we've just talked about, we can't anticipate the specifics of what's that going to look like. Right. But no, it's just because something's difficult does not mean it's not worthy. And so I think the world of foster care and adoption invites us to marry that. It's like so worthy and it's so difficult, and they both can be true. And that's where we have to kind of shed the self-sufficiency and say, I need God more than ever, and I need community more than ever. So my biggest thing would say, don't go it alone.
Wow. That's so good. I love that. Actually, it's funny. Like, if it's not difficult, it almost doesn't seem worthy, right? In a lot of ways, like it's not anything that's worth doing is going to be difficult. Yeah. And I love that, in our mindset, we typically, like you said, we make those mutually exclusive concepts, but they're actually very married concepts. And you're going to find beauty in the difficult. You're going to find worthiness in the difficult there.
Right. And I think so often as Christians, we think, what have I done wrong? Like, this is hard. What have I done wrong? Like God, like what, and I think that that's just such a, again, that's one of the beautiful invitations of this road with so many things that I would have never chosen is really shedding that idea that like, it is hard. And like I said, grief and loss are going to continue to be part of the journey. And then it doesn't mean that I've somehow disappointed God or that I'm not following him. The fact that things are so different than what I thought that they might look like.
Yeah. I say jokingly sometimes that, Psalm 23:4 talks about though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? We all know that one, but Christian culture has, for whatever reason, historically taught us to think that we visualize we're walking on the mountaintop with God and then we slip and we fall into the valley and God's like up on the mountain going, well, you're gonna have to get your way out of this one. I'll be up here waiting for you when you get out of this. And it's like some kind of punitive thing. Right. And that is not at all what the valley of the shadow of death is by any means. In fact, there are many times that God will lead us into the valley of the shadow of death. That they're actually those are the paths of righteousness that verse 3 is talking about, the valley of the shadow of death. And so you're definitely walking that. You've opened up a little bit of the book in this conversation, but I'd love to hear, what your hopes are for this book, A Love Stretched Life. I love the title of that, by the way. My goodness, that's such a it's a very compelling title. It gives me a huge picture of what you're talking about there. But I'd love for you to just tell us what your hopes are for this as you were pouring your heart into it. You're sharing some of your story, and as it goes out into the world.
Yeah. I think for me, I honestly, the fact that this has turned into a book is so delightful for me, but it didn't start out that way, Davey. It really started out with me trying to remember the details, because as life happens and life happens fast, I just felt like I was not recalling some of the ways that I felt and heard and saw God show up in my life. And I just wanted to recapture that. And so that's kind of how it started. And then, a long ways down the process, here it is, it's a book. But really, I think if I had like a thesis statement for the book, it's that proximity to people different from us change us. And there are some times that, that God has come and it feels like it's this like beating of a drum, like, okay, it's here. It's so clear. Right. And then there are some times that God comes to us and it's just like a little whisper. and you have to like lean in. And I just think through the people and the places and the situations, through the 3 boys that have come into my family via foster care and adoption, through walking alongside my 14-year-old's, first mom and seeing her struggle and with addiction and what that has taught me about, how we all have to decide for today. I mean, it's not just for an addict that has to decide what is mine to do for today. There's just such a closeness, such a nearness, such a rawness with walking along someone who is daily giving it their all to stay clean and sober. I mean, that has taught me so much. And then, parenting a child with a brain-based disability, I feel like proximity to those different has profoundly changed me. And it has led to this love stretch life. And so really a love stretch life is kind of talking from beginning to where we are now, but it's certainly not a story that's wrapped up like we talked about. It's not a story that has a bow around it. It is a continual unfolding. It's a stretch. And I'm trying
broadening, and I just love
exactly.
terminology.
But exactly. I'm trying not to live a love snapped life. Like I want it to be stretched, right?
Yeah, we just want to be stretched. We don't want this thing to break.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. But in the stretching, that's where I found God, honestly.
That's it. Yeah. And I think sometimes in the stretching, you're surprised of your capacity to continue to stretch.
Yes.
Because
it's not our capacity, right?
It's not, you're not enough, Jillana.
Right.
I don't know if you know that, but
I do know that. Yes.
Right. It is somehow he makes us more malleable. He makes us more flexible to be able to stretch and to bend into the different weavings of our life that he has set out for us. And, we don't have the capacity for it, but by his Spirit, we do. And it's so evident on your life too, Jillana. It's so cool to just hear a little bit. I mean, I feel like we just got a little snapshot of your journey, and I want to make sure everybody goes and picks up A Love Stretched Life. We've got a link right there in the show notes for you guys to easily access it. But man, Jillana, thanks so much for spending time with us and sharing some of your journey, some of your story. How can folks connect with you? How can they follow what you're doing?
It's kind of funny to give out my Instagram right after saying how much
the time limit. I know.
Right, exactly. My time limit. But I am on Instagram and Facebook. I do check it, though I monitor myself and at Jillana Goble, and JillanaGoble.com is where people can connect with me. And I love connecting with folks. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been a joy and a privilege. And I just really respect what Nothing is Wasted is all about. And thank you. Thank you for what you do and what you give, born out of so much loss yourself as you're coming alongside others as we all search for God in the midst of the mess.
Well, thanks, Jillana. Nothing is Wasted wouldn't be very much if it wasn't for folks like you who are willing to come on and share their story and be vulnerable. So thank you so much for taking the time, waking up early over on the West Coast and spending time with us. It's been awesome to have this conversation with you.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.